that contained the wet swatches were transported back to the Los Angeles Police Department and then discarded. Do you have an opinion on whether that was an appropriate procedure to follow in the collection and processing of bloodstains?
Yes, I have an opinion.
And what's your opinion?
That anything that contained the evidence, such as this plastic bag, should be retained.
And why is that?
To answer any question that comes up later, was there anything in the plastic bag that could have interfered with any subsequent test? Was the bag itself something that could interfere with any subsequent test? Was there any residue of the sample, since it's placed in there wet, that could be of some value for further testing?
Is preserving packaging material important if there's some question down the road about whether evidence has been switched or altered in some fashion?
Yes.
And if there is blood residue left on the inside of the plastic bags, can that be useful in testing whether or not a later sample actually came from that bag or not?
Yes.
You're familiar with the term a photo log, are you not?
Yes, I am.
And what's the purpose of a photo log?
A photo log is like a diary. It's a sequential list of photographs that are taken in any particular event involving an investigation.
And you have an understanding as to whether or not a complete photo log was kept by Los Angeles Police Department that documents the order in which pictures were taken at the Bundy or Rockingham scenes?
No foundation, no personal knowledge, not sustained.
Do you have any knowledge of whether or not a photo log was maintained for photographs that were taken at Bundy and Rockingham?
Same charges.
I have some information.
And do you have an opinion on whether or not appropriate documentation with respect to a photo log was kept of photographs taken at the Bundy and Rockingham scenes?
Foundation.
Sustained. From your knowledge of what was done with respect to creating a photo log, do you have an opinion on whether that was done adequately by the Los Angeles Police Department?
There's no foundation.
Sustained.
Did you attempt to locate a photo log from the Los Angeles Police Department showing the order in which photographs were taken at Rockingham and Bundy?
Yes.
Have you ever seen such a log?
Not relevant.
No.
Is such a log important?
Yes.
In your opinion, is it an acceptable procedure to process a crime scene such as Bundy and Rockingham without keeping a photo log?
Not relevant, no. No foundation.
Is it an appropriate practice to keep a photo log?
Yes, it is.
Specifically with respect to evidence items such as the socks that were found at Mr. Simpson's residence in this case, do you believe that it's important that a complete documentation be maintained as to when photographs were taken in what sequence of an evidence item such as that?
Yes.
Are you familiar with the use of videotaping or video cameras in the processing of crime scenes?
Yes, I am.
How is a video camera useful in processing a crime scene?
The
Unless he's used one before himself.
Foundation.
Are you familiar with techniques that are used to document crime scenes through the use of videotaping?
Vague, but familiar.
Overruled.
Yes.
And what are those techniques?
The technique of walking through a crime scene and viewing the scene through the camcorder.
Now, does that serve some purpose with respect to briefing other officers on what is at a crime scene?
That's exactly what I recommend in my teaching of crime scene investigators, is to use this camcorder, and particularly the kind that has a viewing screen on it, for a quick review for people who arrive at the crime scene who want to know or who need to know what the crime scene looks like, rather than having them walk through the scene again and in adding any other possible changes to the scene, to view the scene on a camcorder.
Now, what's the disadvantage of not having a videotape to show other officers?
Well, if they genuinely have a need to know, they have to go into the crime scene and walk through it.
Why isn't just taking still photographs acceptable by itself?
Well, he didn't say it. This is back something else.
Sustained leading.
Well, can the same purpose be achieved by taking still photographs at a crime scene?
To some extent, Polaroid photographs taken at a crime scene, because they're developed almost instantly. But regular photography requires, even if there's an all-night 1-hour service, at least an hour.
Now, do you know whether or not the Los Angeles Police Department has videotaping equipment available to it?
Yes.
Now, we've had testimony that the only scene videotape that was taken was for insurance purposes at Rockingham after a search was conducted. In your opinion, is that a proper use of the videotaping equipment that they had available to them?
Yes.
Sustained. Foundation.
In your opinion, is it acceptable or unacceptable if a police agency has videotaping equipment available to them to not take any videotapes of a crime scene?
No foundation.
Sustained.
There's been testimony that Detective Furman used the interior of Nicole Brown Simpson's condominium as a sort of command post after he arrived at the scene. Do you have an opinion on whether or not that was an appropriate use of the inside of Nicole Brown Simpson's condominium?
Sustained. Misstates the evidence.
There's been testimony that the inside of the condominium was used by police officers to either sit down and make notes or conduct briefings of other police officers. Do you have an opinion on whether or not that is appropriate?
That misstates the testimony.
It's compound.
Foundation.
It's compound.
What's your understanding of the use to which the inside of Nicole Brown's Simpson's condominium was used by the Los Angeles Police Department at the time that they arrived at the crime scene?
Calls for hearsay, irrelevant, no personal knowledge.
Overruled.
I heard the testimony of some of the investigating officers
And that was asked to what?
to going inside the condo.
Now, is that an acceptable procedure in your mind?
Vaguest acceptable. No.
Sustained.
Do you see any problem?
Counsel, just focus in on the particular witness that sat on the couch and made notes. Focus in on the particular witness who used the telephone. Focus in on the particular witness who used the lights. These are very vague questions unless you want to narrow it down to the evidence in this case.
With respect to Detective Mark Furman using the inside of the condominium to sit down and write his notes, do you have an opinion on whether or not that was appropriate?
It's vague, no foundation.
Overruled.
It is inappropriate to do that unless that area had been processed for evidence
And-
before that time.
Why is it important that the inside of Nicole Brown Simpson's condominium be processed in any fashion?
Because it is adjacent to, and at least in my opinion, part of the overall scene.
Now, you're aware of, I believe it was Officer Risky's testimony that he used a telephone inside of Nicole Brown Simpson's condominium to, I believe, contact other police officers. You call that testimony?
Yes, I do.
And do you have an opinion on whether or not that was an appropriate action to take on his part?
No foundation.
I have an opinion,
And
yes,
what's your opinion?
that was inappropriate to use the phone inside the victim's house at that time.
And why is that?
The most obvious reason would be if somebody else had used that phone that is involved in this situation, there could have been fingerprints on that phone. The other reasons are because of technology today and redialing. And again, I'm not of my own knowledge, but testimony I heard that there's other mechanisms on that phone that would indicate the last incoming call that.
The state's testimony motion to strike this testimony.
All right, that, as to the technology regarding last incoming phone number, that'll be stricken. Not supported by the evidence.
Well, is there do you have an understanding of whether that telephone was able to store the last number that was used to call out?
Your Honor, there's no personal knowledge, no foundation for this.
Overall, overruled, but we talked about last number redial is what we talked about.
Yes.
And he's already answered that question.
Okay. What's your understanding as to the timing as to when the coroner's office removed the victims' bodies with respect to that crime scene being actually processed?
That the bodies were moved at approximately 10:15.
And was that before or after that crime scene was processed?
This would have been before criminalists Fung and Mazzola did at least most of their processing.
Have you reviewed the testimony of Detective Lang with respect to his reasons why the bodies were removed prior to the time that the crime scene was processed?
Yes, I have.
Do you recall him using a term, close-in crime scene?
Yes.
I'd like to read from page 17-638 and ask the witness his opinion of this explanation, if I might.
I want to give counsel the site.
17-638. Mr. Ragle, I want to read to you the testimony from Detective Lang with respect to why the scene was processed in that manner and ask your opinion about this. Bundy was a close-in crime scene. The victims were close to one another. The evidence was close to the victims. A determination was made, as one example, to remove the victims prior to the evidence because of this. If the evidence had been several feet away or out in the street or something else, perhaps the victims would have stayed at that location while the evidence was collected. You just have to deal with what you have. Do you have an opinion on whether that is an acceptable explanation for why the bodies were removed prior to the time that the crime scene was processed?
A is too acceptable, no foundation.
Foundation for the opinion, examination of the crime scene photos, appreciation for the proximities. You need a foundation for that.
In forming an opinion that you have you considered the crime scene photographs that you've reviewed, as well as testimony about the order in which things were done and the proximity of various pieces of evidence to the bodies?
Yes, I have.
And do you have an opinion based on that as to whether Detective Lang's explanation for why that was done is acceptable or not?
I have an opinion.
And what's your opinion?
Well, today is too acceptable.
Oh,
It is my opinion that that is not an acceptable explanation.
Why not?
It is 180 degrees in opposition of how a close-in crime scene should be processed. The evidence that is nearest the body, you have to start from the outside and work your way in. And you can't move, you could move the victim, and you should move the victim, obviously, if the victim's alive. I mean, you have to endanger the evidence to save the person's life, and that happens a lot. If there is no chance of that, then it's a slow, methodical approach to the victims, and it's the last thing you would do would be to move the victims. And you should never move the victims over the evidence or have to move the evidence in order to move deceased individuals.
Now, have you examined photographs of the various pieces of evidence in this case and determined that some items of evidence were moved from the taking of one picture till some later picture, specifically the envelope and the glove?
Yes.
What is the importance, in your view, of determining how that kind of movement of evidence took place?
The appropriateness, did you say?
What is the importance, or is there any importance to trying to determine how evidence got moved prior to the time it was collected?
Yes, there is some importance to that.
And what's that importance?
The importance is, I'm looking over here, I thought the photos were still there, is that the...
Would you like to refer to those?
I don't think I need them.
Okay.
It's just that any evidence that is in the path of the movement of the deceased and the people, to lift an adult, it requires at least two people. So there has to be an intrusion into the very heart of the crime scene here. And obviously anything that is in the way can get moved, or it can get stepped on, or it can get altered.
Now, with respect to trace evidence, such as dirt or other trace evidence that might be on an item of evidence, such as the envelope, what's the proper procedure to use to preserve that type of evidence?
You're talking about loose material, or?
Any trace material that might be apparent on an
Okay.
item that's on the ground.
I believe the appropriate material to remove any evidence that is fragile is to do it at the crime scene, to inspect the evidence, to determine if there's something that would be lost if you attempt to pick it up and put it in a container, and if that's the decision of the criminalist, to collect it there rather than take the chance of losing it.
Now, you talked a little earlier about the proper photographic documentation for items of evidence. Let's talk specifically about blood drops. Have you reviewed the photographs that have been made available to you of the what's been called the Bundy blood drops?
Yes, I have.
And do you have an opinion on whether or not that photographic documentation that you have seen is adequate?
It is not.
And why is it not adequate?
Excuse me. Yes, I have an opinion.
And what is that opinion?
That it's not.
Why is it not adequate?
There are a couple of reasons. Every photograph of something like that that's close up, I think I mentioned this earlier, should have a ruler, and in the case of something like blood drops, should have a indication of the direction, compass, not the direction necessarily of the movement of the blood, but of north. or some reference point, so that a viewer later on can see this, the ruler can tell them the size, and obviously there has to be some other indicator or marker, a number, an item number, or something like that, and in a direction of north.
Here, I have a photograph to mark. It's next in order.
This would be 1329. 1329.
All right, may I put this on the Elmo? Let me show you what's been marked as Defense 1329. That's a picture of one of the Bundy drops that's been referred to, is it not?
Yes.
And can you use this picture as an example of how that was improperly documented, at least through this picture?
Only one of the items that I suggested a moment ago shows up in this photograph, and that is there is a tag indicating a photo number. That's appropriate. What's inappropriate about that tag, by the way, is the placement of it. It is too close and is obliterating, or at least, I shouldn't say obliterating, it is masking the area underneath the piece of paper. It's like a 3x5 card or something like that. And that's too close. There should be, it could be this close if another photograph is taken without anything in it. But what is missing here entirely is a ruler and a pointer or a notation that north is, you know, to the top or to the bottom or to the side, whatever the photograph is, however it was oriented.
Mr. Ragle, is it important to, when processing a crime scene, to preserve blood spatter evidence that might be on items in the direct, or in the immediate vicinity of the crime scene?
Yes, it is.
And are you familiar with blood spatter that appears on the gated area in the surrounding the area where Mr. Goldman's body was found?
I've seen the photographs that were supplied to me, yes.
And what's the importance of adequately preserving that kind of evidence?
Eventually, a scene like this, there would be some attempt to interpret what happened, to reconstruct the events. And all that cast-off blood or spattered blood or whatever the reason that blood appeared there could be used to determine what happened.
And from the material that you reviewed, do you have an opinion on whether that aspect of the crime scene was adequately documented?
No foundation.
Sustain.
What materials have you reviewed with respect to that area of the crime scene?
A series of photographs that were supplied to me.
And from the photographs that were supplied to you, assuming hypothetically that those were the only photographs to preserve that evidence, do you feel that the photographs that you were provided adequately document the blood spatter on that area of the crime scene?
I think it's, we're vague because we don't really know what we're talking about here, which photographs we're talking about.
Well, the photographs that you reviewed were what? What did they show?
Referring to the gate and to the railing?
The metal fence that surrounded the area where Mr. Goldman's body was found.
There was an assortment of photographs that showed the various blood, what would be called blood spatter or splatter.
Now, if that is adequately documented through photographs and measurements and any other means available, is it possible to attempt to reconstruct what might have happened in that area, at least partially, that accounted for that blood?
No foundation.
Well, that'll be the purpose of taking the photographs.
We have had testimony that a criminalist Fung, at the direction of Detective Lang, removed the glove in the bag that had been found at the Rockingham area and took it into the Bundy crime scene, climbing over Mr. Goldman's body, I believe, to show it to Detective Lang.
Sustain. Restate the question.
Are you familiar with the testimony that Dennis Fung took the Rockingham glove inside of a bag into the Bundy crime scene to show it to Detective Lang?
Yes, I am.
Do you have an opinion on whether or not that is an appropriate technique to use?
That bag is too appropriate in the foundation, also it wasn't a technique.
Or what?
I have an opinion.
And what's your opinion?
My opinion that nothing should be taken back into the crime scene from one crime scene to the other.
Why is that?
It's just a bad practice. There's a chance that something can go wrong and contamination could occur.
Have you reviewed the testimony with respect to Mr. Simpson's reference blood, specifically that it was taken by Detective Van Adder back to Rockingham?
I'm familiar with that.
And do you have an opinion on whether or not that was appropriate for Detective Van Adder to do?
I have an opinion.
Or what?
What's your opinion?
The same exact situation. I don't believe that any evidence should be taken from one location back into another location unless there's some, extremely important reason. And I can't imagine any reason would be that important.
Have you reviewed Detective Lang's testimony with respect to why the hands of the victims were not bagged separately prior to the time that the coroner moved the bodies?
Yes.
And what's your understanding of his reason for that?
Calls for hearsay.
Sustain.
Do you have an opinion on whether or not it is acceptable in moving bodies from a crime scene that the entire body be contained in plastic as opposed to the hands being individually bagged?
Your Honor, it's beyond the scope of his expertise.
Or what?
If I understand your question properly, it isn't appropriate to not bag the hands.
And why is that?
In any type of crime where there's potential contact between two people, there is the possibility of trace evidence underneath the fingernails or on the hands. And once the remains have been placed in a body bag, the chances of that evidence being contaminated by some of the victim's own blood, which is going to be loose in that bag, is obvious.
Now, what is the appropriate procedure for when bodies are transported in a sheet or a body bag with respect to preserving the container that was used to carry the bodies?
I recommend that container be retained
Why is that?
because key pieces of evidence, significant material, can fall off of the remains, off the clothing, and if it's in the bottom of a body bag and that body bag is disposed of, so is the evidence.
Did you review the testimony of, I believe it was Mr. Fung, who testified that Mr. Simpson's reference blood was placed in a garbage bag at Rockingham to be transported back to SID?
Did I hear that? Yes.
Sustain. Rephrase the question.
Did you review the testimony of Dennis Fung that he placed, or that the reference blood of Mr. Simpson was placed in a garbage bag at Rockingham to be transported to SID.
Incomplete, it's also leaving, Your Honor.
Sustained. No, it's an appropriate way to pose the question. Reference sample inside the gray envelope, inside the garbage bag.
The reference blood inside the unsealed gray envelope inside the trash bag. Have you reviewed that testimony?
Have I reviewed the testimony?
Yes.
I watched the testimony.
And also, did you watch the testimony that Mr. Fung testifying that Andrea Mazzola, who was carrying that garbage bag, was never informed, or was not informed when she was transporting as to what was in it?
Yes.
Do you have an opinion on whether or not that was an acceptable procedure?
Your Honor, that goes beyond the scope of his expertise.
Overruled. You can answer the question.
There are 2 to 3 different levels here. First of all, the bag itself is not in and of itself anything inherently wrong with that, as long as it's a fresh bag. The container, this container, I'm holding up this analyzed evidence container that is
160.
used for blood vials, should have been sealed. And
163H.
And it's inappropriate, it may not be the right word, but it's just a big chance of giving something like that to somebody to carry and not informing them what's inside of it because of the fragile nature of a glass vial.
Are you familiar with testimony to the effect that the envelope with the prescription glasses contained within them, that at some point after that item was collected by the Los Angeles Police Department, one of the lenses disappeared?
Mistakes in testimony.
Sustained.
Are you familiar with testimony to the effect that originally there were 2 lenses in the glasses that were in the envelope? It was retrieved from the Bundy crime scene, and now there's only 1 lens.
Mistakes in testimony.
Sustained.
If it came to your attention that there was a piece of evidence that had been collected in one form and part of that evidence had disappeared at some later time, what is the appropriate response of the investigating agency?
Your Honor, that goes beyond the scope of his expertise.
Overruled.
Your foundation.
Overruled.
It would be in my opinion that they should make an attempt to find out why some of the evidence is missing.
You and I discussed the other day the concept of a team approach to processing of crime scenes. Do you recall that?
Overruled. It's foundational.
Yes, we did.
And does that tie into what you were talking about earlier, having the coroner and the criminalists and the detectives working together?
Yes.
Why is that important?
In a death investigation, it's important to have the 3 different disciplines involved in the investigation because of their varying levels of expertise. The detective or the police investigator has a particular function. The deputy coroner is what I would consider a scientific investigator, has a specific function that complements the investigator's knowledge, and the criminalist's job is to come to the crime scene with a knowledge of crime scene reconstruction, a knowledge of the types of evidence that they can look for at different types of crimes and how to collect and maintain that evidence in as close to possible its original condition. And then there is another person in this team, and I don't think you mentioned them.
And who's that?
The field evidence technician, or what some people call the identification investigator.
Do you, incidentally, do you have an opinion as to whether Dennis Fung and Andrea Mazzola, given the manner in which they processed these 2 crime scenes, whether they were practicing criminalistics, if you will?
Well,
Oral.
It's my opinion that they were not practicing criminalistics as it should be done at a crime scene.
And how are you using that term, criminalistics?
As a forensic science investigator that is trained and is knowledgeable of the types of evidence, how they should be collected and preserved.
You have a minute, Your Honor? Mr. Ragle, assume hypothetically that items of evidence such as the envelope and the glove had been moved in some fashion. Whose responsibility would it be to determine who moved it, how it was moved, and why it was moved?
Calls for speculation unless it's familiar with our opinions.
Oral.
It's also
Oral.
The responsibility to determine that depends on the timing when it's noted. If the crime scene criminalist comes to the scene and sees something in one location and a little bit later he sees it in another location, it's his responsibility or her responsibility right then to try to find out why or who moved this. If it's discovered through some other method later on through photography, then it is a departmental issue. And it would be either the chief criminalist or the director's responsibility to find out, who is moving things unauthorized, and I'm assuming this is unauthorized movement, at the crime scene. And or possibly the departments, if they have that type of follow-up investigation somewhere else in the department.
Mr. Ragle, have you examined the Mr. Simpson's Bronco in this case?
Yes.
And I'd like to put up People's 197A. Have you specifically examined the area of the door sill, the bottom area of the doors, the front doors of the car, the area that's below the bottom of the door?
Yes, I have.
Now let me show you. I want you to assume hypothetically that Detective Furman testified that he observed what appeared to be some blood marks in the bottom area of the door. And I want you to assume further that criminalist Fung examined the door sill area in an attempt to identify those marks and circled the three areas that you see on that photograph. You have that in mind?
No, misstates the testimony.
Sustained.
Detective Furman's testimony.
Sustained.
hypothetically that Detective Furman testified that he observed 4 brush-like marks that appeared to be bloodstains on the door sill area of the Bronco.
Misstates the testimony, Your Honor.
I see counsel decide well with the court, please. Mrs. Robertson? Mr. Blake?
Specifically, with respect to...
I'm sorry. Oop, sorry. Miss number 1.
Thank you.
Mr. Blasier?
Thank you. Mr. Ragle, with respect to the, on the photograph up on the screen, the circled area on the right and the 2 spots that appear to be circled, the top circle in the diagram, you have those in mind?
Yes.
Based on your observations of the Bronco, the times that you've looked at it, can you see those 2 circled areas if the door is closed?
Your Honor, no foundation that the door was on it when he inspected it.
Let me comment about this photograph first, if I may, because I can't...
Nope, you have to answer the question.
Okay.
Well, can you tell from that photograph, can you get oriented with that photograph?
I can get oriented with this photograph, yes.
Okay.
And in my opinion, you could not see 2 of these locations if the door was shut.
And which 2?
The one furthest, it's coming off the screen now, the furthest to the right, and then of the 2 on the left, the upper one.
record, we should have those two, an arrow put on those two and print it out. And number this exhibit our next in order.
All right, this will be 1330.
Mr. Ragle, do you have an opinion on whether the bottom left circle would be visible with the door closed?
I believe it would, yes.
All right, record reflect that arrows have been placed on the two circles which Mr. Ragle has testified are areas which could not be seen with the door closed. That'll be marked as Defense Exhibit 1330.
Let me just clarify my earlier question. With respect to not the circles themselves, but the markings inside the circle on the two that had the arrow on them, to your opinion, that the spots inside those circles would not be visible unless the door was open?
Yes.
That's all I have.
All right, Mr. Goldberg?
Maybe we could just leave that up there for a second, just so we don't have to
Sure.
waste time.
Good place to start.
Mr. Ragle, may I start, Your Honor? Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Ragle, if you look in the upper left-hand corner of this photograph, can you see the initials DF for Dennis Fung? There's a little bit of a glare. Maybe we can move it over a little bit.
I see those initials, yes.
Okay. And was it your understanding of the testimony that this particular photograph was testified to by Dennis Fung, not by Mark Furman?
This photograph?
Yes.
As far as these markings, yes.
Yes. And was it your understanding of the testimony that Mark Furman's testimony was that he saw blood stains on the lower portion of the driver's door as opposed to the sill?
His objection was sustained on the
Sustained.
Okay. Now, when was it that you last saw the Bronco in this case, sir?
March 14th, I believe, of 1995.
And is that when you made the examination that was the subject of the most recent line of inquiry by the defense regarding the Bronco?
No.
Have you seen it since then?
No, I had seen it before also. But that in terms of looking specifically for the shape of this area of the door and what would be the enclosed area if the door is shut, that's correct. The door was not on it at the time that I looked at it, but the other side door was.
Okay, so at the time that you looked at the side that's depicted in this particular photograph, is it correct to say that the door had already been removed?
That's correct.
Okay, so you're forming your opinion as to what could or could not be seen based upon your examination on the 14th of March without the benefit of having the driver's door in place. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And I don't know if this is beyond the scope of your expertise, please let us know. But is it your understanding from owning cars and observing cars and being a criminalist, presumably doing investigations involving cars, that sometimes the alignment is different on one door as opposed to the other?
That is indeed possible.
Now, Mr. Ragle, you've been critical of some of the procedures that have been used in this case to do the crime scene investigation. Is that correct?
Yes, I am critical.
We can take the photograph down. Okay. Thank you. And with respect to the Bronco, if blood had been observed on the lower portion of the driver's door of the Bronco, and someone had thought that that was significant from a forensic science standpoint, if you had been out on the crime, at the crime scene as a criminalist, would you have wanted to remove that evidence at the scene as opposed to removing it at some later point?
Yes,
And what would the reason for that be?
because of the fact that you have to transport a car under those circumstances, and unless you have an enclosed carrier, something could happen to that sample.
In other words, just very simply, in the 14 or 15 mile drive or however long it is back to the print shed from the scene at Rockingham, there would be a great likelihood of perhaps that evidence towards the bottom of the door becoming washed off or somehow obliterated. Is that correct?
Could be very possible.
Okay.
If it's, they drive through water or something like that.
Right. And we'd be very concerned that we might not be able to find that later on. Is that correct?
That's a possibility.
Now, sir, based upon your extensive experience as a criminalist and also training police officers, is it your understanding that police officers have often submitted items for analysis at the laboratory that they believe to be blood that turned out not to be blood?
Yes. Or not to be human blood or something like that.
And would you agree that when you're looking at a tiny little dot of a reddish, brownish spot, for the police officer who is not trained in criminalistics, it may be difficult to tell for sure whether you're really looking at something that's blood as opposed to something that's just a little dot of mud or some other material. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So would you be surprised if a police officer were to look at a Bronco door and perhaps mistake something for blood that was not blood?
That could happen.
And it was your opinion that at least one of the dots of blood that we saw in the photograph that was just shown to the jury probably would have been visible from the exterior of the Bronco with the door closed. Is that correct?
Well, I have no knowledge that that dot was blood, but whatever that is low enough that it would be visible.
Okay. Now, I'd like to get into a little bit of your qualifications and your experience. Sir, did I understand your testimony to indicate that you were actually a police officer at one time?
Yes, it was.
And did you ever achieve the status of detective?
No.
Okay. Were you,
I just want to qualify that. At the time, the city of Berkeley, and I think even today, did not have the position of detective. Each patrolman investigated the case that occurred on their beat. The only level of non-uniform investigators was called an inspector, and they did not work in the field. They coordinated cases in the department.
okay. And did you have occasion to investigate any homicides as a police officer?
No.
All right. Now, you retired from the Orange County Sheriff's Department in 1989, is that correct?
That's correct.
And now you're doing consulting work,
That's correct.
and that's primarily in laboratory design.
In management and needs assessment, actually. That's probably more in line with what we've been doing lately than the laboratory design.
How many public criminalistics laboratories have consulted you for the purposes of deciding how to redesign or build a laboratory since that time?
Had actually hired me or consulted me? Hired me, 2.
Okay. Now, since 1989, how many homicides have you been the primary criminalist who was investigating the crime scene?
None.
And how many crime scenes, homicide crime scenes since 1989, were you a secondary criminalist or assistant criminalist investigating that crime scene?
None.
How many rape crime scene investigations have you participated in as a criminalist since 1989?
None.
Any major crimes or significant crimes since then?
No, none.
Any minor crimes where you've been the criminalist who was investigating the crime scene since 1989?
None.
All right. Now, between the years of 1976 and 1989, you were basically in upper management of the crime laboratory, either the director, or what was the other position that you mentioned when it had another
It's
title?
the same position, just a different title.
Right. Now, during that period of time, between 1976 and 1989, can you give us the estimation as to the number of homicides where you were the primary criminalist investigating the crime scene?
None.
Well, how many were you assisting in investigating the crime scene during that period of time?
Exact same number. None.
Okay. What about rape cases? How many rape cases were there during that time frame where you were investigating
Still
the crime
talking about 1976 to 1989?
Yes.
None.
scene? Major crimes?
None.
Minor crimes?
None.
Now, you mentioned to us that you had written a book, not a book, you had written a chapter in a book regarding crime scene investigation, is that correct?
That's correct.
And what was the title of the book again?
Principles of investigation, I believe.
Now, sir, there are some leading forensic textbooks that cover the subject of crime scene investigation, is that correct?
That's correct.
And some of those are Richard Saperstein's book called Criminalistics. You're familiar with this.
That's correct.
And you've relied on this in forming your opinions about crime scene investigation, is that correct?
No.
You haven't?
No.
Is there some reason for that?
I don't have it.
Oh, you haven't read what Mr. Saperstein has to say about
No.
crime scene investigation? Isn't he one of the leading authorities?
I don't know.
But you've heard of him, certainly.
Yes, I do.
Yes.
I heard of him.
Okay, and you're familiar with the book entitled Forensic Science: An Introduction to Criminalistics by Peter DeForest, Dr. Ganslin, and Lee, is that correct?
I've read part of that.
And this is considered to be a leading forensic textbook, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And have you relied on portions of this book in forming opinions about crime scene
Portions of
investigation?
it.
All right, we'll get into that a little more later. And you've heard of the book Forensic Science Handbook by Richard Saperstein, is that correct?
I've heard of it.
And this is a leading textbook that's probably on the shelf of every criminalist, maybe in the country, is that correct?
It's in our library.
And have you relied on portions of this book in forming opinions about crime scene
No,
investigation?
I haven't.
You haven't?
No.
Well, isn't this one of the leading books discussing forensic evidence?
I don't know,
Why don't you know?
because I haven't read it.
You haven't read any of it?
No.
Well, Have you read Richard Saperstein's other book entitled Forensic Science Handbook, Volume 3?
No, I haven't.
Isn't this also?
I have read some of that. If that's got a chapter in it by George Sensabaugh.
Well, Mr. Sensabaugh has a chapter in Richard Saperstein's earlier work. Could this be what you're thinking of?
If it's talking about the polymarker likelihood in enzyme typing, yes.
Okay. An earlier work dealing with conventional serology, is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yes.
All right. Well, we'll get to that a little bit later. But then the Richard Saperstein Forensic Science Handbook, Volume 3, you don't think you've read this, is this correct?
If it's not the one that has Dr. Sensabaugh's article, that's correct.
But isn't this also a text that would probably be found on the shelf of most criminalists throughout the country?
I'm sure it may be.
Okay. Now, you've talked a little bit about footwear impression evidence in this case, is that correct?
That's correct.
And you know William Bodziak of the FBI.
Yes, I do.
Are you familiar with his book called Footwear Impression Evidence?
Yes, I am.
And have you read at least the portions of this book dealing with crime scene investigation as it relates to footwear?
I've read portions of it. I don't know which section you're specifically referring to.
You don't think that you've read the whole?
I haven't read the whole book.
Have you read entire chapters dealing with crime scene investigation?
No.
All right, and isn't this also a leading book that would probably be a reference that would be consulted by any criminalist who's routinely doing footwear examinations?
Yes,
They probably have this on their shelf as an
I'm sure
ordinary
they do.
reference.
All right, Mr. Goldberg, about 5 minutes.
What?
About 5 minutes.
And are you familiar with Barry Fisher of the crime laboratory here in our county of Los Angeles?
Yes, I am.
And you're familiar with his book, Techniques of Crime Scene Investigation?
Yes, I am.
And have you read this book?
Portions of it.
Okay. And have you relied on portions of this book in forming opinions about crime scene investigation? Barry Fisher's book.
I've considered it, yes.
Okay. Now, you testified about certain techniques like the, I want to be sure that I understand the terminology you used. You talked about a technique that could be used to take dust prints off a substrate, is that correct?
Yes.
And what did you refer to that as?
It's in here, it's a static electrical device that lifts prints.
Oh, the electrostatic dust
Yes.
print lifter. Okay.
Yes.
And is it true that at the time that you were processing crime scenes, that device hadn't even been invented yet?
When I was investigating crime scenes, yes, but not while I was a director of the lab.
Okay. Your Honor, did you want to stop at this point, you said?
No, just finish out the half
Okay.
hour here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought the court said that you wanted
No.
to stop at 2:30.
I did, but we go by that clock.
Oh, okay. All right.
All right.
Now, you also talked about this course that you've taught at Cal State Long Beach. Is that correct, sir?
Through Cal State Long Beach.
All right. And is this a upper division course for criminalists who are getting a master's or PhD?
I don't believe Cal State offers any such course.
Okay. Is this a course that is primarily geared for criminalists or one that is primarily geared for police officers and a category of people that we refer to as crime scene technicians?
The course I referred to is the latter. I also taught a course that trained criminalists.
Okay, well, I was talking about the course that you were referring to during the direct examination.
Yeah, I'm still doing that. The course that I taught at Cal State Long Beach for criminalists, I no longer teach.
Okay, but the course that you were referring to in direct examination would then be a course that is primarily geared for what we would, or what you would use as a criminalist, what you would describe as a layperson?
No. I'm sorry.
Don't-
I didn't understand your question. Maybe you should.
Is the course geared for what you would describe as a criminalist as being lay people? In other words, non-criminalists?
No. No, I would describe them as police investigators or crime scene investigators.
Well,
Now,
if you-
some of them are untrained when they come to the class, if that's what you mean by lay people.
Okay, but do you consider a crime scene technician to be a layperson in reference to a criminalist who is considered to be a professional in the area of forensic science?
No, I think many of the field evidence technicians and ID people are professionals. Depends on their time and their training and their experience.
But whatever they are, you would not consider them to be forensic scientists, is that
They're-
correct?
I consider them forensic scientists. I don't consider them criminalists.
You consider police officers to be forensic scientists?
I consider a person who applies scientific techniques at a crime scene, such as fingerprint dusting, collection of searching crime scenes with analytical instruments such as the devices you're talking about, or lasers, or
Well-
other techniques, to be scientists.
Well, at any rate, police officers are not criminalists, is that correct?
Some police officers are also criminalists.
Well,
but
very, very few, right?
Nowadays, very, very few.
And evidence technicians are not criminalists, is that correct?
That's correct.
Can you give us, maybe, if you can give us a minute-long definition of what an evidence technician is?
A field evidence technician is an individual that is trained in documentation of a crime scene, of recognizing and searching for some of the evidence, and collecting it.
Okay, I'll pick up after. All right, thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a brief mid-afternoon recess. Remember all my admonitions to you. Mr. Ragle, you may step down and come back in 15 minutes. We'll stand in recess for 15. In the Simpson matter, let's have the jurors, please. Deputy McNair. All right, Mr. Ragle, would you resume the witness stand, please? All right, let the record reflect that we've been rejoined by all the members of our jury panel. Mr. Larry Ragle is again on the witness stand undergoing cross-examination by Mr. Goldberg. And Mr. Goldberg, you may continue
Thank
with
you.
your cross-examination.
Mr. Ragle, where we left off is you just given us a definition of evidence technician. And is it fair to say that these people are people that do not have criminalistics degrees, but have received some training in how to go to a crime scene and collect evidence?
That's correct.
And is it true that these evidence technicians are used very widely, probably throughout this country in police departments, in collecting evidence at scenes, including homicide scenes?
I believe every type of crime scene.
And that's also true of the sheriff's department when you were working there, is that correct?
That's correct.
In fact, is it true that most of the field work that was done by the sheriff's department was done by evidence technicians, not criminalists?
Numerically speaking, yes.
And that was mostly for cost reasons, is that true?
Yes. Not entirely, but for the everyday type of crime scene. For homicides and other more complicated crimes, there very often is a type of evidence that a criminalist has had special training in. For instance, blood spatter interpretation, explosive debris, arson, and drug, clandestine drug manufacturing laboratories that the ID technicians or field evidence technicians haven't had. So that's why they being the criminalists would go to the more complicated crime scene.
Where there was special types of evidence, is that correct?
That's correct.
But you
And
did-
special problems.
But you did have evidence technicians, non-criminalists, doing things like collecting blood evidence, didn't you?
Yes.
And you had them collecting evidence that would later on be used for hair and trace analysis.
Yes.
and you then analyze that kind of evidence. I don't mean you individually, but your lab, and you presented your findings in court, even though it had been collected by an evidence technician. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And is it your view that that is acceptable from a forensic standpoint?
If the evidence technician has been trained properly, yes.
Is it also your view, sir, that even a police officer or a police officer is qualified to collect biological evidence that's going to be submitted to the laboratory for analysis?
If they have been trained properly, yes.
And is it also your view that a police officer would be qualified to collect evidence that's later on going to be submitted to the laboratory for hair and trace, such as articles of clothing?
With the same stipulation, yes.
And although it is more expensive, would you agree that it is preferable to send criminalists to do the crime scene investigation as opposed to crime scene technicians?
If the need is there, yes.
Now, getting back to the issue of qualifications, sir, when I asked you about these various books that you, some of which you're familiar with, or many of which you're familiar with or heard of, is the reason for reading these books, this kind of material, is so that a criminalist can maintain current with what is going on in the forensic science community?
Not entirely. Books of this nature are never really current because by the time they're written, new stuff has come out. Journals, such as the journal published by the American Academy and by the even the newsletter of the California Association of Criminalists, and the journal produced in England, the Forensic Science Society's journal in England, are current. They're contemporaneous with what's going on, within the last few months.
But it is important to read the literature, though, to understand what is going on in the forensic science community, what the capabilities are, what the issues are, how to do things,
A
etc.
textbook like this, the type that you refer to, are particularly important for somebody who is being trained or being introduced into the field.
And isn't it also true that in the area of crime scene techniques or crime scene investigation, there aren't a lot of recent articles in the journals with respect to how to investigate a crime scene, because it's really not a hot topic, so to speak, in the forensic science community?
They're more in the British publication than in the American Academy. In the American Academy, they have some case-related articles describing evidence at the scene and things such as that, but most of that is research.
And since you knew that you were going to be testifying here about crime scene investigation, did you feel that it was important to review all of the key literature that's available on the issue of crime scene investigation in preparation for your testimony?
Objection made as to what considers key literature.
Sustain, rephrase the question.
Well, there are certain books and publications that discuss crime scene processing that are particularly well recognized. Is that correct?
Yes.
And those are the ones that I asked you about here this afternoon. True?
I believe so.
Okay. Did you feel that it was important to review all that material in preparation for your testimony on the witness stand here today?
No, I didn't.
Okay. And was that because for the $35,000 you didn't feel that this was, that you thought this was just beyond the pale of what you were asked to do here?
Objection, argumentative.
Oh, you can answer the question.
The $35,000 that I've been paid was to do specific functions, to attend specific meetings, to make certain observations. It had nothing to do with reading textbooks.
Okay. Now, in the area of serology, conventional serology, do you consider yourself to be an expert?
In doing the test, no.
Do you consider yourself to be an expert in the area of the polymerase chain reaction test?
In conducting the analysis, no.
And are you an expert in the area of RFLP DNA analysis?
Again, in conducting the analysis, no.
Do you currently consider yourself to be an expert in the area of hair and trace analysis?
And I don't believe the basic science of hair and trace analysis has progressed much since I stopped doing it. There are some new instrumentations available, but I still consider myself competent in that type of examination if I had the equipment.
When's the last time that when did you stop doing hair and trace analysis?
When I was promoted to the director,
So that was before 1976?
yes.
Okay. So if this jury were interested not in a critique of what happened at the crime scene, but in trying to figure out what the effect was of crime scene processing on the biological evidence in this case, would you agree, sir, that you would not be the appropriate person to be able to tell us that?
Objection argumentative, and I'd like to
Sustain,
approach.
rephrase the question.
Sir, do you consider yourself to be qualified to tell us the effect, if any, that the crime scene investigation had in terms of the actual outcome of the DNA testing in this case?
Yes, I do believe I can answer that question.
You consider yourself to be qualified?
To answer that question, yes.
And have you rendered any analysis in this case about the actual test results and what they either show or don't show?
No, I haven't.
So what you've basically testified to here are things that possibly could have happened during the crime scene processing, is that correct?
In a sense, yes, but not completely. I mean, I'm basing that statement, the statement that I said that I believe I can explain, at least have an understanding why some of this evidence degraded, doesn't require an expertise in knowing how to analyze or to conduct the amplification process of PCR or the analysis of reading the results. I don't believe it requires a knowledge of the finesse of doing the RFLP. It is simply a question of my experience with previous cases where samples were stored in plastic while moist and the results of what happened to that evidence.
You are qualified to tell us that wet blood degrades more quickly than dry blood, is that correct?
In certain conditions, yes.
In certain conditions?
Not in every condition, but in certain conditions.
Okay. But what I'm asking you, sir, is if what we are concerned about are the actual test results themselves. This is something that you did not look into, is that correct?
I did not review in any detail the test results and compare them to any other results. That's correct.
And would you say that the person that would be most qualified to be able to tell us what effect, if any, the crime scene investigation had on the actual test results, I'm not talking about degradation, but the results, would be an individual who is an expert in conventional serology and or DNA evidence?
Objection argumentative beyond scope.
Well, I certainly think that somebody who has more knowledge about the techniques could add to what I'm saying, but I don't think the basic statement that I'm making is any different.
About degradation?
Yes.
But I'm not asking you about that.
What are you asking me?
I'm
I don't know.
asking you about the actual type and results themselves.
When you say the type of results, you mean the specific answer.
Yes. Would you say that someone who is an expert in both in DNA testing and or conventional serology would be in a better position to answer those kinds of questions?
About the results, yes.
All right.
The actual interpreting the dot blots or interpreting the autorads and things such as that, and trying to explain what type of degradation or what degradation would do to affect those, yes.
Well, for instance, let's say that we're interested in the issue of contamination. You're aware that some studies have been done on that issue, aren't you?
Beyond the scope.
Well, have you read any studies by the Federal Bureau of Investigation on the issue of sample handling and how it can affect, or whether it affects, DNA typing results?
Beyond the scope.
I'm familiar with many of the programs that were presented at meetings that I attended at the FBI Academy dealing with DNA handling and sampling, but I don't recall anything specifically about what you're asking. I mean,
You don't-
maybe you can amplify or clarify that.
Do you remember a study that had to do with using different kinds of devices like scissors, contaminated scissors, to cut swatches, and people coughing over the evidence, and various other sample handling
No,
issues?
I'm not familiar with that.
You're not familiar with that?
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to have to ask you, first of all, Mr. Ragle, would you allow the lawyers to finish asking you the question? And Mr. Goldberg, would you allow Mr. Ragle to finish his answer before you start to follow up, please?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Take a breath. Proceed.
Oh, thank you. Now, let's get into the issue of collection of evidence. We've heard a lot of testimony in this case about gloves, wearing gloves at a crime scene. Are you generally familiar with that testimony?
Yes.
And do you believe that gloves always have to be worn at a crime scene, whenever someone is actually on the crime scene?
It depends on the nature of the crime scene.
Did you see a picture of what has been testified to as being Mark Furman's hand pointing at a glove?
I did see that picture, yes.
And Mark Furman's hand did not have a glove on it, is that correct?
That's correct.
You don't see any problem with that, do you?
If that's all they did was point.
Okay. So the issue that has been made of people wearing gloves under those circumstances in this case is a false issue. Isn't that true?
It states his
Argumentative.
testimony, argumentative.
But at any rate, sir, if someone is actually standing on a crime scene and not wearing gloves, you do not have a problem with that, is that correct? Even if they're pointing to a piece of evidence?
Yes, I don't have an objection to anybody who is walking into the crime scene and just there momentarily not wearing gloves.
Okay. In fact, did you participate yourself in a search of the Bronco on August the 26th?
Beyond the scope.
Sustain.
Well, it says to crime scene processing, Your Honor.
Sustain.
Sir, do you always, well, have you always worn gloves when you're at a crime scene and your hands are very close to a piece of evidence? Say that there's a spot of blood over here on this book that I'm going to collect. If my hand is anywhere near that spot, would you say that that is a situation in which gloves should be worn?
Beyond the scope. We didn't talk about gloves.
Over.
The use of gloves for something like that and other types of evidence has evolved over the last few years. And so just to pick up a book, even 10 years ago, would probably not require putting on gloves. If it's a book, now if it's a book with biological material spattered on it, that changes it.
No, I'm not saying pick it up. I'm just saying if your hand's near it. I don't need to use gloves in that situation, do I?
It depends on what's going on at that time, what else is going on in the room, wherever you're at. I mean, for instance, in this room, certainly not. In a crime scene today, it depends on the nature of the crime scene, whether protective clothing, not just gloves, but other types of protective clothing, should be worn. And it's a decision that has to be made by the crime scene team.
And that mostly has to do with the fear of communicable diseases, is
That's
that
the
correct?
original, as I said, this has evolved.
Yes,
That
right.
was the original concern that most investigators had, is other types of, not the evidence, but them, they did not want to get contaminated.
Okay, if you were searching a piece of evidence, let's say the Bronco, and there was some blood on the console of that Bronco, would you put your hand in the immediate area of that blood, not touching it, but within a few inches of it without wearing gloves?
Objection, beyond the scope.
May I be heard? You're also aware that a lot of testimony has been elicited about hairnets, is that correct?
Hairnets?
Hairnets?
I don't know specifically of hairnets.
Or head coverings?
Head
things-
coverings,
Yes.
I do believe, I don't know what you're referring to.
And is it your view, sir, that a crime scene investigator does not need to wear a hairnet when they're at the crime scene?
Well, I actually recommend that at a scene where there is blood, that booties, hairnet, and a disposable paper suit be worn.
Well, if you were searching the Bronco, would have you worn a hairnet? Sir, with respect to the picture that we have marked as defense last in order, you didn't write a number on it.
Was that 160, I'm sorry.
1330. Yeah, maybe with the court's permission, I'll just write a number on the back of that. Oh, this is our copy, I'm sorry. Do you have it? Sir, direct your attention to 1330 for identification. Do you recognize this photograph?
Well, I can see everything except whose initials it is up in the
Okay.
corner.
Were you present when photographs were taken of the Bronco on August the 26th?
What day were you there? That was in March, wasn't it, of 95?
Both.
Both, all right. March of 95.
That's all. They're both.
I understand, but the only thing that was listed on direct was March of 95.
Okay. And the reason that you indicate that people should wear lab coats or hairnets is to protect themselves, is that correct?
Objection, this takes testimony.
Oh,
There are three reasons. One is to protect themselves. The second is to protect the crime scene from anything falling off of them onto the crime scene. And the third is to identify them as one of the only 4 people or 5 people, depending on the situation, that should be in the crime scene. So in essence, it's a uniform that if somebody else is in the crime scene without all this stuff on, you know that they shouldn't be there. And as a member, you can tell them to leave.
Okay, well,
So
at
the
the
three
Orange-
purposes.
At the Orange County Crime Lab, when you left, were people routinely wearing,
At certain types of crime scenes,
but not at all types of crime scenes, is that
not
correct?
at all types of crime scenes.
And usually when they would wear lab coats and hairnets and protective garments, it was when they were using chemicals for the purposes of processing the crime scene, is that correct?
When I left, we were not doing PCR.
No, I mean chemicals to enhance blood at the crime scene, such as luminol and the like.
When I was there, we didn't use any luminol. But basically, your answer is correct, that primarily people were trying to protect themselves at that time.
And what about booties? Is that standard at crime scenes?
It's becoming standard.
Okay, is it standard at crime scenes?
I think it is now.
Are people commonly wearing booties at crime scenes at the Orange County Sheriff's Department?
I can't answer that question.
Were they when you left?
No.
And you haven't been to any crime scenes that were in progress being investigated between the time that you left and today's date?
Well, it's a slightly different question.
I have not been to any crime scenes, that's correct.
Now, do you agree that it's okay to use clean cotton swatches for the purposes of collecting biological evidence?
Yes.
And did you do anything to try to determine whether or not the substrate at the Bundy crime scene, particularly the Mexican paving tiles, were appropriate for using a chisel or some type of instrument to chip the blood off?
Did I do anything? No.
And if the blood is partially absorbed into a porous surface, if you want to remove as much of the blood as you can on relatively small dots, is the cloth swatch technique an appropriate technique?
I believe before I said that it was, but I also qualified it by saying that if possible, some of the samples, there should be at least an attempt to remove some of the sample without wetting it. If that is not possible, then some moist removal is permissible.
And is it correct that you don't know whether or not it was possible to use another technique here?
That's true.
But just using common sense, is a dot of blood on concrete or a porous surface generally going to be difficult to scrape up?
Difficult but not impossible, because I have done it at crime scenes.
But generally it would be difficult.
It takes time and more work. The swatch is quicker.
Is it okay to use distilled water for the purposes of moistening the swatches?
It's required.
Okay. And is it okay to use clean instruments as opposed to sterile instruments?
Sterile is not necessary.
Now, with respect to collecting samples and air drying them at the scene, do you believe that the forensic science literature supports the view that you should always air dry at the scene or sometimes air dry at the scene?
You have to qualify that answer by, of course, saying what the conditions are at the scene. I mean, if the conditions are such that air drying immediately could contaminate something because of air movement or something such as that, when I say the Orange County is equipped with a device that's sort of a protective device that can be used to put not swatches but swabs, the cotton swabs in it, and air moves gently through it. So there's no absolute answer to that if there are some extraneous conditions. But my belief is that in this situation, that they should have been dried.
Now, sir, you said that one of the books that you considered in part was the Forensic Science and Introduction to Criminalistics. Is that correct?
Is that Dr. Lee's book?
Yeah, and DeForest. Sir, do you agree with the view that sometimes it may be better to air dry blood samples before collecting them or packaging them for transportation to the laboratory?
Counsel, you want to show that to Mr. Blasier first?
I haven't, I'm just asking the question.
All right.
Sir, do you agree that
No, I have no objection as long as the whole paragraph's read.
Well, I was only intending on reading part of it. If counsel wants the rest, he could read it later. I'll
Proceed.
lend him the book.
Well, I object to just reading part of it.
Counsel, you can do that on redirect if you like. Proceed.
Sir, do you agree with the view that times it may be better to air dry blood samples before collecting them or packaging them for transportation to the laboratory? The decision about how best to collect blood evidence should be made by crime scene searchers in consultation with laboratory analysts. Laboratory analysts are in the best position to know what they are or not equipped to do and what kinds of samples they are set up to handle. Sir, do you agree with that?
Yes. And taken out of context,
Well, would you like to see the context and perhaps
yes.
read more of it? Okay.
Where were you?
245, the paragraph that starts with the word sometimes.
Well, may I read the few lines just before that?
Sure, if you like.
It says garments bearing wet or moist blood stains must never be sealed in airtight containers such as plastic bags. Well, a swatch is cloth, and that's synonymous with a garment.
Right, but
And the never has been bolded here.
yes, but they're talking about garments in the first paragraph, right? The paragraph that you read. And they're talking about blood stains in the paragraph that I read from. Isn't that correct?
They are talking about garments, but we're talking about cloth. And garment and a piece of cloth, to me, is synonymous. A piece of swatch is a little tiny piece of a garment, in effect. And then to go on further, if you have some untrained crime scene investigators at a crime scene, and they have a blood sample, and they don't know what to do with it, it is very likely that why this author or these authors are saying this is that if the blood is moist, like
Yeah, there's no question pending at this point.
Well, counsel, he asked if he could read the rest of the paragraph.
I let him
He's
read
done-
what he wanted
You've
to.
done that. Ask your next question.
Yeah, okay. Sir, does the paragraph starting with the word sometimes simply provide in the first line that sometimes it may be better to air dry samples, blood samples, before collecting them or packaging them for transportation to the laboratory? Did I
It's
read that correctly?
you read that correctly.
And did you know, sir, did you hear any testimony about how long LAPD has used the practice of using plastic baggies for the purposes of transporting the bags to the crime lab?
If I did, I don't remember how long.
Okay, well, if they've been using it for more than 17 years, would you say that they have a considerable amount of experience in this technique?
They've done it a lot of times.
And doesn't it appear to you that what Drs. DeForest, Ganslin, and Lee are particularly concerned about here is that the decision about how to collect evidence from a crime scene should be made in consultation with a laboratory analyst?
Simple answer to that is yes, but I do need to qualify that.
And what is your qualification?
What I tried to say a moment ago, if the people who are collecting the blood are untrained, and this is something that's fundamental, we teach all the crime scene investigators that are non-scientists in terms of their background. If they have an issue about a question, you call your crime laboratory serologist, you ask them what to do. And this is talking about calling to find out what to do, because if you got wet blood at a crime scene, it's still wet. I don't think this means you wetted it, you made it wet. It was dry to begin with, you made it wet, you've made it wet again, that you don't dry it right away. They're talking about whole blood, wet blood. Whole blood contains all kinds of information that dry blood doesn't. Blood cells, for example. Blood cells are still intact in wet blood. And it may be very advantageous to bring that blood into the crime laboratory immediately. And under no circumstances would an analyst in a laboratory say, well, put it in the back of your truck for 8 hours and bring it in then.
Sir, would you agree that with respect to whole blood at a crime, first of all, do they say anything about whole blood anywhere in the paragraph that I read from, or the paragraph above it that you read from?
It says sometimes it's better to air dry blood samples. It doesn't say, it just implies that they're wet samples.
Well, where does it say whole blood?
It just says dry blood samples. They're talking about wet garments. They're not talking about swatches or I don't see the word swatch or I don't see swab here. I just see wet blood on garments. And then they're talking about better to air dry it. Sometimes it's better to air dry it, sometimes it isn't.
Your Honor, perhaps I can introduce this page into evidence so the jurors can look at it themselves, but I may make a Xerox copy later on. It's page 245.
Not at this point.
Could-
That's still a hearsay source. Proceed.
Well, sir, you did say that you relied on this book, in part, in forming opinions about crime scene processing. Is that correct? Sir?
Yes.
All right. Now, did you read any materials that were written by Dr. Henry Lee on the issue of collecting evidence for DNA typing?
No, I haven't.
You didn't read a document entitled Guidelines for the Collection and Preservation of DNA Evidence? You've never seen this before? By the FBI?
Oh, I didn't realize, I believe I read that. I didn't realize that Dr. Lee was the author of that. I'd have to look at that, though, to verify that I read that.
Okay, I'll let you take a look at it.
Actually,
Does this refresh your recollection as to whether you read this?
I can't tell just by looking at that. I'd have to.
Oh, okay.
Was there a cover with a publication date on this?
Sir, I'm sorry, did you say that you recognize this or not?
I don't believe I have read this, but what I asked you was, is there a publication date? I don't see it, but
No,
I don't
I
believe
don't.
I have read that.
Sir, would you agree that with respect to whole blood samples at a crime scene, that a clean cotton cloth, gauze, or cotton swab could be used to soak up the liquid if other equipment is not available? And if this method is used and a significant delay will occur in getting the specimens to the laboratory, the blood should be air dried out of direct sunlight prior to submission to the laboratory?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Are you aware of any research in the scientific literature as to what constitutes a significant delay with respect to blood samples?
Any literature? No.
Yes. Now, when one is collecting a blood stain at a crime scene, do you believe that it is not necessary to remove the entire stain?
Stain, for instance, underneath the body can be huge, and so that's not necessary. Having been involved in the laboratory analysis of some samples in the past, the more you collect, the better. So effort should be made to collect all of the stain. If you're talking about an individual drop, a smear, something such as that, all of it should be taken.
Okay, sir, do you agree with the statement that once an adequate series of photographs has been taken, some or all, if necessary, of the sample can then be removed from the scene?
Again, that's not quite totally clear, but yes, if an adequate sample, for instance, if it's a big pool of blood, you would probably pipette some of it up. If it's an individual drop, all of it should be kept. It should be photographed first, and then it should be taken from the scene.
So you're saying that the sentence that I just stated to you is not really clear as to what exactly it means?
It's clear, but it's not complete.
All right. Well, sir, isn't that what you wrote in the chapter that was in the book that you participated in, entitled Principles of Investigation?
Could be. I don't remember what I wrote. That was 1979.
Maybe I can approach.
You want to show that to Mr. Blasier first? Mr. Goldberg, why don't you show that to Mr. Blasier first? Proceed.
Now that I see this, I think this is great. No, this is correct. This is describing a particular situation, and it's complete for that particular situation.
And what is the situation that it's describing?
Where there is a sample of blood, such as a blood drop, and I'm saying once an adequate series of photographs have been taken, some, and then parenthetically, or all if necessary, meaning if it's a small sample, of the sample can then be removed from the scene. Or, let's see what else it says. You want me to read the rest of it?
Well, does the rest of it have to do with how much of a blood stain you need to collect? Is there anything else in there that
Yes,
has to do with
yes.
that? Okay, then read it.
How the investigator chooses to accomplish this removal will depend on how much material is present in the sample, how old the sample is, if known, where the sample is located, and what it has been exposed to so far, if known.
Okay. So would you agree that with respect to a single dot of blood or drop of blood, there is no rule as to exactly how much you need to remove?
Would I agree that there is no exact rule?
You don't necessarily have to remove the whole thing, is that correct?
For a single dot,
Yes.
I think you do have to remove all of it until you are satisfied you've got as much as you can get.
But that's not what you said in your book, is it?
Well, there's no reference to a tiny little dot. This could be a huge bunch of blood is what I'm talking about. I mean, there's no reference to the size. I believe it's clear, as I said before, not knowing I wrote it, that it is clear what is said there. But what I said was that it is incomplete the way you read it because I don't know what size blood stain you're talking about.
But the size blood stain that's referenced in your book, or in your chapter rather, is a drop of blood. Isn't that what you're talking about?
Again, I'd have to look at it.
Well, when you just looked at it?
I didn't see anything about a drop. I just said a blood, I believe it said a blood, I don't know what it said anymore. I don't know whether it said a blood stain or a blood sample.
That's okay, I think it's in the record,
But
so let's go.
the point is,
There's no question pending, Your Honor.
Well, see, no, the question was, did he recollect that? Was that in his writing? Let's proceed.
Now, sir, would you agree that with respect to crime scene documentation, that the purposes of good crime scene documentation is simply to be able to place the items of evidence in effect back in the crime scene, to know exactly where they came from?
that's certainly one of the reasons.
Would you say that that's really the key goal?
No.
All
It's
right.
one of the key goals.
Well, what other goal is there?
To begin the chain of possession, to begin the history of that sample, establishing that this is the same sample that was at the crime scene that I'm holding up here in my hands right now in a court of law.
Okay, now, is there any accepted practice throughout the country that in order to do that, videotaping the crime scene is necessary?
No.
In fact, would you say that as of today, videotape is not a standard practice at crime scenes?
It is regional. Departmental choice. It's not a requirement.
Some crime labs are using it in some jurisdictions and some aren't. Is that correct?
Some, I don't even know if it's crime labs, or I think it's the police departments that are using it.
Okay. And there is no statement in the forensic science literature anywhere that you absolutely must, to be competent, use videotape at a crime scene. Is that correct?
That's correct. That I'm not aware of that anyway, put it that way.
Now, sir, with respect to the issue of trace evidence, are you familiar with Locard's exchange principle?
Yes.
And is that when there is contact between two or more surfaces, there will be a mutual exchange of matter across that contact boundary? And that in some instances, transfer of materials can result without contact. However, that's rare. Do you agree that that is an appropriate statement of the principle?
I agree with everything but one word that you said.
Which would be what?
That you said they will be transferred. I think they may be transferred.
Okay. Or there may be transfer that's beyond our level of detectability. That's also a possibility. Is that true?
That's
But-
possible.
Sir, would you say that with respect to the blanket, the most likely transfer would occur if the blanket were on top of Nicole Brown, between the blanket and Nicole Brown?
So I don't know that that's an intelligible question. The
If the-
transfer would happen between the blanket and Nicole Brown. Between means, do you mean from one direction to the other?
Well, there would be an exchange.
All right.
If there was going to be an exchange between the blanket and anything at the crime scene, it would be most likely to be Nicole Brown, since it came in direct contact with her. Is that true?
I can't answer that question. I think for that limited part of the scenario where the blanket is now on top of her, yes. But I don't know the history of what the people did with this blanket when they brought it out, whether they opened it up like you would do a sheet or your own blanket when you're putting it under the bed. I mean, I don't know that. And so it would depend on the care they used. Assuming there's something on the blanket in the first place, that if they open it up and fluffed it around or straightened it out, somebody, it's got to be, I would imagine, at least two people or four to do this. So I can't answer the second part of your question.
What would you say, based upon the extent of your knowledge, that the most likely transfer would probably be between Nicole Brown and the blanket?
Once it's in contact with her, yes.
Okay. And were you aware that there were no hair and trace items, or are you aware of whether there were any hair and trace items found on Nicole Brown of some probative value in this case?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
Now, you said that there is a possibility that bringing the glove into the crime scene could result in some kind of an exchange. Is that correct?
I didn't say that in a sense. I possibly said could, but I said it's a bad practice, and that it opened up the possibility
Okay, well,
of something bad happening.
If the glove was never taken out of the bag, would you say that that possibility is so remote that it's not even worth discussing?
It doesn't change my opinion about a bad practice,
Yeah.
but if the bag is open and people are looking in it or putting their hand in it, that changes it. If the bag is simply open, the chances of something jumping into that is obviously remote
From the crime scene.
from anything.
And the chances of something jumping out of the bag into the crime scene, again, would be very remote, wouldn't it?
Probably more remote.
Now, sir, do you believe that it is a good forensic practice to wait until daylight to begin a crime scene investigation?
Not to begin it, but it's certainly good practice to continue it into the daytime or to return, keep the crime scene protected and return to the daytime.
Okay, the Barry Fisher book is one of the books that you considered, is that correct?
In parts of it, yes, but I respect Barry Fisher.